Let's be brutally honest right now. That's a big question.
I'm looking for someone who doesn't want to go to base camp, but they want to go to the very top.
Whether it's here, India, New York.
Civilization was born at happy hour.
That's what wins. That's what stands out. That's what people are interested in. That's what I want to know. The Hospopreneurs Podcast with James Henderson.
Hello and welcome to episode 99 of the Hospopreneurs Podcast. Two-time Australian Sommelier of the Year and founder of national industry conference Grow Assembly, Banjo Harris Plane joins me on this episode as the founder of Good Pair Days, a wine delivery business with a subscription box that tailors to customer tastes. Vogue called it the Netflix of wine. Prior to Good Pair Days, Banjo founded a European fine wine importing business and for 5 years was the general manager of the internationally renowned restaurant Attica. Hello and welcome to the show, Banjo.
Hey James, how are you?
Very well, thank you. Very well. It's a pleasure to have you on the program today. I'm very excited to get into it. As you know, the first question I like to ask is a crazy hospitality story. Being from an ops background, I'm guessing you've got a crazy story to share.
Sure, yeah, I had a good think about this one. I've got a few. I think the most family-friendly but still amusing one probably comes from my time when I was living in Sydney and I was working at Key Restaurant. We had a problematic guest in that they were very picky in terms of exactly what they wanted, when they wanted it, how they wanted it. And unfortunately, our service just wasn't up to the task, in their opinion, that night. So they had a few complaints and they were sitting really right down one end of the restaurant looking out over the harbour. They had a really great table, beautiful view. In our eyes, we'd done a lot of things right, but they were that unhappy that they got up from their table and they walked all the way to the other end of the restaurant where the reception desk was. And, a few things had gone wrong. I'm not going to shy away from that. But essentially, they were standing there complaining to the general manager and the head of reservations about all these things that had gone wrong. And just that they'd kind of finish their spiel on how terrible we were and how nothing could possibly be worse. The lift doors open, so the lift, it goes down to the car park, but it's also used right towards the end of the evening by the chefs who are heading downstairs to the office or to one of the storerooms. And unfortunately, at that point in time, the lift doors opened and in the lift were about, I would say, 12 to 15 very large bags of rubbish. And lying on top of it was a chef sort of reclining in a very relaxed manner on top of these garbage bags. And that was kind of the final moment for this guest's experience at Key Restaurant. After that, they just left.
Oh my God, that is definitely a crazy story. Thank you for sharing that one. I know that there are heaps like that in the industry. That was a very honest story as well. I appreciate you sharing that too. So thank you, Banjo.
Indelibly printed in my mind ever since.
And apologies to Key as well, obviously there. Sorry, guys.
Let's move on.
Yeah, we'll move on to the next question. Banjo, I like to take things into a macro perspective here, thinking about things very laterally. Why do you do what you do?
I was brought up in a household that was lucky enough to have good food and good wine as kind of a pillar of our lives. My parents owned restaurants when I was younger, and there was always been a really deep appreciation for food amongst our family. We don't have a huge family, but it's a bit of a cliche thing, but food really brings our family together. Any family occasion is really either a decision about where we're going to eat, or if it's at someone's house, there's a big spread. It really focuses around the dining table. And as well as that, my dad is a big believer in having a really strong set of personal values, and I think probably the phrase that springs to mind to kind of encapsulate it is treat others the way that you want to be treated, and that's something that he really drummed into me as a young man. And I think putting those two things together, a love of food and also treating people the right way, it's kind of no surprise that I ended up working for a lot of my professional life in high-end restaurants where good food and good wine and exceptional customer service all kind of came together. So they're things that I take with me wherever I go, and certainly in this next phase of my professional life, I still certainly try and focus on that idea of treating people the way that you want to be treated. Customer service for me is a bit of a meta skill. You can apply it to any industry. Some industries do it better than others. Obviously, restaurants put a huge emphasis on it, but I think any industry can be improved through exceptional customer service. I think any business can stand out in a crowd if they employ fantastic customer service.
I'm interested there because obviously your dad's philosophy and your upbringing have influenced how you have behaved in your professional life. The type of service in high-end restaurants, you mentioned your experiences in high-end restaurants, the type of experience in those sorts of venues has also changed as well. What's the sort of common denominator that you've seen in that experience, and how has your personal philosophy meshed with that as it's evolved?
I think the best high-end restaurants in a modern setting make the customer an active participant rather than someone just kind of sitting on the sidelines being dictated to. And so involving people in what's going on, whether that's sharing a story or, asking them questions, caring about how they think, what they feel at any given time. These are pretty basic things, I think, if you just look at customer service as a whole, but certainly within restaurants, I feel, and it sounds like you agree, but certainly things have changed from the old method of just high-end restaurants and high-end service has to be personified by this very regal, noble, slightly pompous kind of air. Because you're paying a lot of money, you should be surrounded by essentially nobility. I don't think that really gels anymore. People don't think that way. People are happy to pay a decent amount of money in some instances, but they need to be comfortable. They need to feel welcome. They need to feel relaxed. They need to feel cared for. They want people to pay attention to them. They want to feel in control, I guess, rather than being dictated to.
I totally agree that is the change that's taken place, and we've discussed that on previous episodes. What is driving that change, though? Could it potentially be that there isn't the budget to create that facade? With costs increasing in various ways, shapes, and forms, is it a sociographic change? Is that something that's changing as well? What is it that's really influencing people's behavior, their consumer choices in the high-end hospitality sphere?
I'm not sure I have an easy answer for that one. I think it's probably a combination of some of the things that you've mentioned. I think there's also an element probably of just that traditional younger generation change. People who have been brought up amongst a certain style and wanting to try something different. Just that standard generational change in terms of we're going to bring a fresh approach to it. Why don't we try it this way kind of thing?
In that question, I'm interested in maybe how you've seen consumer behavior change. What have you seen consumers doing differently in the hospitality experience?
Like I said, I think people are happy to spend what may be considered a decent amount of money as long as they feel like they're getting proper value and they're getting something in return that's more than just a meal. And whether that takes it into the experience kind of realm, because I think it's still definitely possible to have a restaurant experience if you have that old school kind of service. But I think people approach high-end restaurants with hopefully more of an open mind, not necessarily actively seeking to educate themselves, but going out with the knowledge that chefs and sommeliers and people who run restaurants in this day and age are real professionals and are committed to their cause, whatever it may be. And there is the opportunity within a dining experience to ask questions and to be engaged and to be involved and maybe to learn something about the style of food that you're eating or the wine that you're drinking or the plate that you're using or the suburb that you're dining in or something like that. People are bringing things back to hyper-locality. They're delving deeply into the history, the social context of many of these food dishes and wines that they're serving. And I think that level of detail probably hasn't happened to such a wide degree and to such a large extent in the hospitality industry before. And that reflects really well on the professionalism of people who work in hospitality. And so people are engaging with that.
Obviously, you've stepped out of that ops space and now you're dealing with a very different kind of business. What are you doing now?
I went through kind of a wild time, I guess about 6 years ago. I was working at Attica in Melbourne, restaurant manager and head sommelier for a very busy restaurant, but I had quite a small front of house team considering all the different things that we had to do and the level of intricacy in service. And I was loving what I was doing, but I was also chasing this crazy dream to become a master sommelier. And at the time, I was traveling overseas a lot to a lot of wine regions. And with a friend of mine who was in a similar position, we decided to set up a small wine importing company to bring some of these wines we were tasting overseas back to Australia. And then about a year after that, I had the opportunity to start an online wine business, essentially a retail business, which is more morphed into a subscription business these days. And so for a little while there, I had these 3 businesses consuming pretty much every waking moment of my life. And it all became a little bit too much to handle. So in the last few years, I've actually gotten a bit more focused, decluttered my professional life, I guess. And now I'm spending all my time focused on the online wine business. It's called Good Pair Days. We've been in existence for nearly 5 years now. It's an online wine business, like I said, with a strong emphasis on our subscription service. And the reason for being is really to demystify the world of wine. And I think anyone who's worked with wine intimately knows how confusing and complex it can be. There's a lot of jargon that's involved. The communication channel from the producer or the grower to the end user, the consumer, is often quite convoluted, and I don't think today still we've achieved the sort of frictionless passage of the right information to people. So that's something that we're always working on. But at Good Pair Days, we just want to make that as easy as possible. We want to present fantastic quality wines from all over the world to people in a really easy to understand manner. And that was always something that I was doing when I was working in restaurants. But having an online business now allows me to communicate with people around Australia on a daily basis. So broadening the customer base, I guess.
Yes. In doing that, how do you go about importing wine? Maybe there's some listeners out there who are working in venues, or maybe they're in an adjacent market. Maybe they're in even the coffee industry. Maybe they're baristas, but they have an interest in wine. How do they go about importing and exporting wine?
Looking back on it, my friend and I found it relatively straightforward. To be honest, the biggest hurdle, as with any business, was just capital. We just needed to save for about 12 or 15 months. We were just putting money aside, our own money. It was a director's loan essentially to the business to get it off the ground. But like I said, we were lucky enough to be traveling quite a lot at the time. So we were seeing these wines in other markets. We were getting to meet producers who were too small or just undiscovered at the time, whose products weren't available in Australia. From that moment, once we had the product, it was really just a logistics exercise, finding the shippers to transport the wine from the winery to the dock, from the dock to Australia and then into our warehouse. It was about teaming up with local logistics companies to pick and pack and deliver the wine to our customer base. It was really just about taking care of for me at least, those details that I didn't really know much about coming from a hospitality background.
Is there capacity for drop shipping to be happening in wine as well?
Yeah, there definitely is. Obviously, the stock levels need to be fairly reasonable. It certainly wasn't something that we could look at when we started this business. We were dealing with quite small quantities, quite boutique products. We were the sole importer. We were paying for the entirety of the product to come from an overseas country to Australia, and we had it all contained in our one warehouse. We weren't distributing it around Australia to other warehouses to then be kind of on-sold. So I think if you've got enough product quantity, then yeah, it's definitely viable.
For those who aren't familiar with the sort of quantities you're talking about, what is that starting or small amount? And then when you talk about a wine warehouse, what sort of volumes do people sort of look at, and what brackets do they look at before they sort of change the size of the storage capacity?
Yeah, so when we started the wine importing business, which was called Real Wines, we were importing 1,500 to 3,000 bottles at a time from individual wineries. And the way that international wine logistics works is that the dozen box of wine goes on a pallet, and a pallet can hold anywhere from 52 to 64 dozen. And then the individual pallet goes into a container, and there are two sizes of containers, 20-foot containers and 40-foot containers. A 20-foot container can hold 11 or 12 pallets, and a 40-foot container can hold 23 or 24 pallets. So when we first started out, we were, like I said, 1,500 to 3,000 bottles. That's a few pallets. It's not even a full container. Obviously, from a scale point of view, we were paying more for our shipping costs to get those wines to Australia. These days, with the importing that we're doing for Good Pair Days, it's on a much bigger scale. So we're bringing in whole containers ourselves and multiple containers from different countries across the course of a year. So our economies of scale are a lot better.
Absolutely. What's the legal situation on that front as well? I mean, obviously different countries have different legislation around their products, and how have you navigated that environment?
Yeah, sure. So Wine Australia is a really great resource. They're the main industry body in Australia for all that kind of thing in terms of legalities for import and export. And luckily enough, they have a super informative, easy to navigate, easy to understand website that answered, to be honest, the majority of those questions. Something that popped up early on in the wine importing side of things was whether you needed a specific license to bring wine into Australia. The answer is no. Anybody can import wine into Australia. You just need to pay the relevant taxes on it, which is why I said the capital thing was a really big thing to start with. So in Australia, for alcohol, there's a 5% import tax, 29% wet tax, which is the wine equalisation tax, and then 10% GST. So you add all those three up and you're at basically 50%. So it's quite a large cost that you're paying on top of the cost of the raw product. So when you then factor all the logistics costs into it, again, it's a little bit easier to understand why a wine that you can buy in a bottle shop in Paris for 10 euros turns up at $50 in Australia. But yeah, in terms of the legal side of things, like I said, Wine Australia was really a big help. And I guess like any startup business, it's just about talking to people who know more than you do and getting as much feedback as possible. So any friends of mine that were lawyers, I spoke to about that. I spoke to logistics experts. We made sure that we spoke to other people who had done what we were doing for a number of years. I think the hospitality and wine industry in Australia, at least, is fairly close-knit. A lot of really strong friendships there. People were more than happy to share that kind of information, especially as we were really the minnows in the pond. So we were just starting out. We weren't threatening anybody's business at that stage. So people were very open with their information.
Who have you looked to model your own growth?
Great question. I think personally I take a lot of inspiration from, I already mentioned his name earlier, Franck Moreau. He grew up in, I think, the Beaujolais region in France. He's been living in Australia for probably over 15 years now. His title is either Group Sommelier or Head of Beverage for the Merivale Group. So he oversees a vast amount of wine purchasing. And he's really done a lot of the things that I've now done, working as a sommelier, wine importing, wine retail sales. And he's always had a really big focus on education as well, which is something that I'm really passionate about. I think within the hospitality industry, there aren't a huge amount of avenues for serious professional growth apart from sort of on-the-job kind of work. And Franck is someone that I look up to in terms of really pushing people to be better at their jobs, to work hard, to focus on the details, and to really become professionals in the hospitality industry.
What are you doing to increase that quality and level of education?
Yeah, thanks. That's another really great question. I'd have kind of two prongs to that answer. First of all, the issue that I guess that we're speaking about, the lack of framework, the lack of structure, or the lack of educational avenues, was something I guess that I only realised about 4 or 5 years ago. Like I said, due to various wine competitions and also international food conferences and things like that, I was lucky enough to be traveling quite a lot at the time, and being overseas, whether in Europe or in North America, and seeing the level of passion and care that was being put into either educational events or lectures or workshops or things like that for people that were associated with food and beverage was really overwhelming for me. And I didn't know of that many things occurring at the time in Australia. And so with some friends about 5 years ago now, we actually established a small food and beverage and hospitality conference. It's an annual conference. It's called Grow Assembly. We've done events in Melbourne and in Sydney and in Adelaide. We're putting on our first event in Tasmania a little bit later this year. It's happening on the 29th of June. And our goal there is to really get to as many places in Australia and provide people with a day of education and inspiration. And that's through inviting people who have achieved success already within their industry to come, share their thoughts, be open to questions, to introduce themselves to the people that come to these conferences, have a chat, and really openly, with a positive outlook, but openly, not shying away from the hard moments, but talk about what it's taken to get to where they are, to give tips and tricks as to how you can achieve success in your individual field. And really, it's a really strong networking event for people who I think otherwise, hospitality can be a really challenging industry in terms of the hours that you have to give to it to get really great, either professional or financial outcomes. So having the opportunity to be exposed to a wide number of, like I said, people who have already achieved success within one day, we've found people have been really receptive to that. So that's been really great.
In building that event, how have you gone about finding marketing avenues to grow that, to grow Assembly? How have you gone about finding opportunities to hit larger markets to promote that event?
It's really about partnerships, I guess, and it's either partnerships for the organisation of such events or partnerships for the marketing of it. The bulk of the work is done by my wife and I. My wife's also from a hospitality background, but say in terms of organising the event in Tasmania. I mean, it's happening in Launceston, and to pull off a high quality event in a place where you don't live and you don't have contact with the local community, I think would be really challenging. So we've teed up with someone who lives there. She's a restaurant owner. She's a leader in her field, and she's got the right contacts. She knows the right people, and she shares our vision for education and inspiration. And so she's really done a lot of the legwork, and we've just provided the framework for that. Yeah, like I said, partnerships for marketing opportunities. We've found that people who have been past speakers or are going to be speakers have been really helpful in terms of spreading the word. Like I said, we try and invite people who have already achieved at least some success in whatever they do. So they quite often already have a strong following, and just talking to them about what we're trying to achieve, we often see really positive results there.
Excellent. What are you learning about now, Banjo? What is it that you're exploring?
Definitely just becoming a better business person. Like I said, a few years ago, I tried to focus in and really, I guess, reduce the clutter in my professional life. Whereas in the past, I might have had 3 or 4 businesses or ideas bouncing around and trying to focus on all of them. Now I'm just working with Good Pair Days. I've got 2 co-founders in that business, and we've got 8 other employees. We sell wine all over Australia. But as one of the leaders of that business, I really need to not only be across every detail of the business, but just try and educate myself as to how we can make that business succeed better. There's no one necessarily above me and my business partners. You know, we're driving every single aspect of that business. So when it comes to improving the bottom line, when it comes to speaking to people about partnerships, when it comes to improving the user experience on our website, when it comes to managing the amount of stock that we're carrying on any given day, it's really down to us. There's no one else who can take that load. So it's about setting up the right systems to have in place within your own business to manage that. And it's just making sure that you're across as much of that as possible. There's always a lot of moving parts in any business, but having an in-depth understanding of them, I think, is beneficial to any business owner.
In your answer there, you said become a better business person. What does that ultimately mean, and how are you learning those things? Are there certain resources that you're absorbing, or models that you're looking to, or people, or are you just learning by trying and failing and then iterating?
A bit of all of those, to be honest. Look, I don't come from a business background. I did an international studies degree, so a lot of humanities focused subjects, foreign language, politics. I did a bit of food writing after university, and then I worked in restaurants as a waiter and then a sommelier and a restaurant manager to get to kind of where I am today. So I have no official business or financial or economic background. To read a business plan or a P&L spreadsheet or to look at numbers with any degree of accuracy is something that I've only picked up kind of by osmosis, by being mid and upper management and owner in various businesses. I think it's a real challenge for a number of people working in small to medium-sized restaurants. They often don't have a financial background, and that can often be a downfall. In my current position, I'm really lucky that one of my co-founders does come from a financial background. He worked with Macquarie Bank for a number of years, and so I have learned an infinite amount from him in how to set up, model and scale a business. If you're not lucky enough to have either a business partner or a co-founder or someone working alongside you, you really do need to go out and like I said before, speak to as many people as possible. You can listen to podcasts, you can look up things online, you can reach out to other successful business people and just try and get a handle on what works for other people and how you can hopefully implement those systems into your own business.
Listeners will know that my background, my formal education's in finance, so I find this particularly interesting, especially when speaking with business owners who aren't from that formal business background. A lot of the time, because they don't know what they don't know, they don't seem to understand how important that is in developing their own business. Obviously, from what you've articulated, you realize that in learning it from one of your partners as well. So it's good to hear that answer from you and elaborate on that. So thanks for sharing that.
Like I said, it's been the biggest learning experience of my life over the last few years because it's a real shift in my focus. Like I said, I studied the humanities and I've worked with food and wine and I have a huge passion for that. But that's really been my sole focus for 10 or 15 years. So in the last 5 years to have more of a focus on the business side of things has been enlightening, to say the least.
Yes.
Banjo, you're coming into a space that is highly competitive. So how have you entered that and how have you looked at competitors when doing so?
Look, the space is highly competitive, but at the same time, it's kind of unexplored in Australia at the same time as well. The percentage of alcohol sales that occur online in Australia is less than 4%. So without a shadow of a doubt, people are still going to bottle shops or wineries to buy their booze. So yes, there are already some big players in there, and I think we've definitely seen in the last 5 years some of those traditional bottle shops expand their online offering to be far more competitive, and I think more and more wineries are moving into that direct-to-consumer space as well, trying to capture more of the market. We're kind of lucky in a way, you know, like 5 years is not that long, but if I look at how things were 5 years ago, it wasn't as crowded. I think definitely in the last 2 to 3 years, there have been more small online wine subscriptions, wine shops pop up. I kind of feel we have a bit of an edge on some of those newcomers, but at the same time, there are also some really strong, really well-established brands and companies that have been doing it for a number of years. And we looked at them really closely when we were starting out. And what we realized was that whilst they were catering to people in terms of the level of discovery they were offering, you know, they were finding small wineries, they were offering wines that you couldn't find at the bottle shop, that was all well and good. But there was no level of personalization. A traditional wine club, for example, if you sign up to it, let's use a hypothetical, James, if you and I both signed up to a traditional wine club today, in our first month, we would probably get a box of 12 wines, and you and I would both receive the same wines. And that doesn't take into account our personal preferences, what time of year it is, you know, whether we had specified that we don't really like drinking Shiraz. You know, there's a whole heap of things at play there. The second thing is that 12 bottles a month, 144 bottles a year is a lot of wine, no matter who you are. I love wine, and I struggle to get through 2 bottles a week, you know, at home.
Yeah.
At dinner, I'll have a glass of wine, maybe 2. My wife won't have 1. You know, that's only a couple of bottles a week. So 12 bottles a month is excessive. So we took those 2 things as real guiding lights, and we said, okay, we're going to cut down on that. We're going to do 3 bottles a month. We think that's fine. If people want to order more, of course they can, but that's all we're going to lock them into. And the second thing is we're going to do our darndest to personalize this to the nth degree. So when people sign up to Good Pair Days, we ask them a number of questions about the sorts of flavors, textures, other wines they like, wine styles they don't like, specific wine colors that they might want to have a preference for or to avoid. If there's, you know, particular wine styles that they've had in the past, if they would prefer to drink only wines that are made with low preservatives, or if they're following a vegan diet, we can only have vegan wines, or if we prefer only to drink chilled wines, whites and rosés as sparklings, etc., etc. And so we build up a really strong initial palate profile for each individual person. And then we make some recommendations. We say, these are 3 wines we think you might like. You don't have to take those recommendations. Of course, if you do, fantastic, we'll send you those wines, and then we ask for feedback. So if you provide feedback for those wines, we feed that information into our recommendation engine. Your palate profile becomes stronger and more accurate, and the recommendation engine becomes a little bit smarter and can hopefully feed on that and spit out more accurate recommendations month by month. So we found that personalization element to be really, really strong.
There are 2 points in your answer there, Banjo, that I want to address, and one is around, you used it very broadly, talking about the engine that's defining what people's palate profile is. I want to address that in just a sec, but the other was that it sounds like it might assume that the consumer at the beginning of that process is more educated. Is there capacity for a less educated consumer to come into that and say, hey, actually, I don't really know these answers about myself?
100%. So in the questions that we ask people, we make a really conscious effort to steer away from any wine jargon. We don't use terminology that people might not be familiar with. And for the majority of questions, we also have an option that just says, I don't know. So if people are not sure whether they like Shiraz or Cabernet, that's fine. We just want to find some sort of baseline, whether they can tell us whether they prefer red wine or white wine, whether they would prefer to have wines that are priced at a certain point. We just try and find some things to initially provide those recommendations. If people accept those recommendations, like I said, from there it's a building process. So if you've answered I don't know to a number of the questions, those first 3 wines are really instrumental in us building a palate profile for you. If you give the wine a score, if you provide some comments, say I didn't like this wine, XYZ, then the next batch of recommendations will hopefully be a hell of a lot stronger.
Ultimately, what if people are answering questions that they don't really know truly about themselves? Maybe they've had a bad Shiraz. You mentioned Shiraz before. What if they've had a bad Shiraz? They've had a bad Chardonnay, and then they say, oh, I don't like that. Do you provide opportunities with that engine to find alternatives to get to something that they may like? Will it find those sorts of answers? What's this engine?
I mean, when we're talking about grape varieties, it can be quite a broad brushstroke, as you say. What if someone just had a bad Shiraz in the past? We don't buy, say, a selection of 10 different Shirazes and then just recommend Shiraz to the people who we think like Shiraz, because those 10 Shirazes are all going to be different wines. So the way it works is every wine that we buy gets tasted by myself and another member of the wine team, and there's over 40 individual data points for each individual wine that we're assessing. And a lot of them, to be honest, I have taken from my previous work as a sommelier in restaurants when I was studying to become a master sommelier. And there's a tasting grid that you have to adhere to when you're formally tasting wine. And I've just taken a lot of those and expanded them out. So the points that we record for each individual wine that we buy are then fed into the recommendation engine, which is a piece of technology that our tech team have built from scratch. And the recommendation engine then basically marries those data points of each individual wine up to people's preferences. So you might tell us that you like Shiraz, but you might also have indicated a preference for other wines in the past that have certain data points. So if our recommendations don't include a Shiraz, there's not necessarily cause for concern. What it just means is that we've identified that you like medium to full-bodied reds with, slightly grainy tannins, elevated acidity, flavors of raspberries that have this much oak usage, this much alcohol, etc., etc. The recommendations are really built on a point-by-point kind of basis, not so much a Shiraz, country, region kind of thing. They're more general markers than the depth that we go into.
I'm interested to elaborate on that engine that you've described as well. So, what sort of calculations are taking place in that?
Like I described, all the wines that we buy, we score or we allocate certain attributes to, and that's based on organoleptic properties, so an actual tasting of the wine. It's also based on the winemaking procedures that have occurred for that wine. It's also based on where the wine has come from, so the vineyard, the region, the state, the vintage that it was grown in, etc., etc. And so each of these form, I guess, a little decision-making tree that gets analysed each time we're looking to generate a recommendation. Let's just say we're trying to recommend a red wine. The engine will calculate down through these various properties, saying each time it gets to a data point, it'll either give a positive or a negative as to whether it fits your profile. Sometimes there are three options, none at all, slightly, or a lot. So that could be in relation to the body of the wine or the alcohol level of the wine or something like that. And each time one of those is ticked off, it'll move on to the next point. And whichever wine in our system at the time has the highest number of matches with that particular decision that's been made, then that'll become the recommendation.
Fantastic. Banjo, who tells you when you're wrong?
Like I said, I have two co-founders in the business, and I think together we make a really great team. Obviously, I take care of the wine side of things, so the sourcing, the purchasing, a lot of the information around the wines. One of my co-founders, his name is Tom. He has the financial background. He wrote the business plan. He takes care of a lot of the marketing. He really drives the business. And my other co-founder, his name's Humberto. He has a tech background and he has built everything that you see pretty much. He built the recommendation engine, the website, our app, etc., etc. So the two of them would be my first go-to there from a business decision kind of thing. I think we work really well together in that no decision that has any real impact is ever made alone, even if it's not your field of expertise. We kind of have an unwritten law that each moderately major decision gets run through the three of us just to get a fresh set of eyes on it, to consider things from a different angle. So yeah, those guys definitely keep me in line. And I guess the obvious answer beyond that is my wife.
Banjo, I want to ask more specifically around having a tech founder. And obviously things have worked very well with the dynamic you have with your partners. When should, in a tech company, someone consider giving equity to an early tech contributor versus having them as a contractor?
I guess it depends on your ambition and your scale and also available capital when you're starting out. For us, the decision was pretty easy because we knew that what we wanted to do was going to be bespoke. We wanted to build a custom recommendation engine that was really going to drive a lot of business for us. And so handing that off to a third party, it wouldn't have been something out of the box. It would have been a bespoke job, so it would have been very expensive. And also, there just would have been too much time spent going back and forth to correct anything, to change things, etc., etc. So for us, the decision was easy. We knew we wanted to have someone as part of the initial team who would commit to it fully and really put in the hours to crafting exactly what we wanted. I mean, you made it specific to a tech-focused business. I guess thinking long-term, I can't see a world in 20 years' time where even restaurants don't need to have a far better understanding of tech than they do today. You know, the level of business that you can do simply by having people, content generators, videographers, photographers, anything like that, that you're able to upload content to your own sales platform. It just makes such a difference in terms of how you can market your business. I think the level of understanding for people in any industry is slowly tipping towards that tech side.
Yes. What is your biggest challenge right now?
Look, I'll give two answers. One's kind of the small scale, tough decisions that we're making. It's a really challenging economic environment. It's a really challenging market at the moment. Australia has been very unlucky. The bushfires were a real tragedy. You know, human life was lost, people lost their homes, and that really resulted in economic failure for a lot of businesses. Now we have the looming threat of the novel coronavirus, and it's really impacting businesses as well. The overall economic outlook is not fantastic for Australia, and that impacts a lot of things, especially when we're buying product from overseas, you know, whether it's packaging or wine itself, that's a problem. So we're looking at ways to counter that at the moment.
They sound like supply side problems as well. I mean, the demand hasn't changed. I'm guessing people still want to buy alcohol, right? They still want to buy wine, but the cost is increasing for those goods over that period. Is that the effect that you've seen?
Yeah, absolutely. The cost and just the availability, you know, the ease of which we can tap into these things. For example, I was meant to be traveling to Europe next week to attend a really large wine fair. Half of it was going to be spent talking to existing suppliers. The other half of it was going to be spent talking to hopefully new suppliers. The whole event's been cancelled because of the coronavirus fears. And so that really sets us back a little bit in terms of the number of new wines that we can offer this year. You know, we had a pretty structured approach to our wine imports this year, and the cancellation of this event has really thrown that quite a lot. So that's a big issue for us for sure.
Why has the negative effect on the Australian industry, the supply side of the Australian industry with, say, the bushfires, why has that had a negative effect on what you're doing as an import business? Wouldn't that mean that there's more traffic to what you're doing, being able to supply the goods that people are still after?
So we're not solely an import business. We have a really strong commitment to the Australian wine industry as well. We have a conscious rule in place that 50% of the wines, at least, that we sell at any given time are from Australia. So it's not just imports. We're dealing with local suppliers and local wineries on a daily basis.
Absolutely. Banjo, you're obviously across many different kinds of businesses. Ultimately, where do you want things to be?
At the moment, I'm really focused on not only growing Good Pear Days, but we also touched on Grow Assembly as well. And I think the thing that's common between those two enterprises is education. Like I said at the start of this interview, I grew up in a household that had good food and good wine around it at all times, so I feel really blessed because of that. And I think great food and the culture that's associated with food and wine can really bring people together. And so I really love sharing my love of food and wine with people. So if I could envision a business that educated people about food and wine and was a successful business in its own right, then that would make me very happy. It's a pretty simple answer. You know, we could build that out a little bit further as to how we would make that happen. But basically, just getting a great glass of wine into everyone's hand would make me very happy.
Excellent. I have one last question for you today, Banjo. Just like to know who you'd like to hear on the show.
Oh, wow. All right, I'll give you two people, one from overseas and one from Australia. I can think of a couple of people who I think would be great on this show, one of whom has been a really big source of inspiration to me over a number of years. His name is Will Gadara. He, up until quite recently, was one of the owners of New York restaurant 11 Madison Park. He also started a food, wine and hospitality conference in North America called the Welcome Conference, from which I drew a lot of inspiration when we were setting up Grow Assembly. He is recently sold out of his hospitality business, as have I, in the last little while, and is focusing on a food waste business. But in the past, he's been involved in setting up a New York wine label, a more casual restaurant within New York. He's had overseas restaurant projects. I admire him very, very much, and I think he's a real hospopreneur. Yeah, and I think someone locally would be the first person that I worked for when I moved to Sydney. His name's Nick Hildebrandt. He owns Bentley Restaurant, he owns Cirrus, he owns Yellow, and he owns Monopole. So with his business partner, who's a chef, he has 4 venues in Sydney. He's really deeply connected in the wine industry, and I think someone who's done incredibly well as a hospopreneur as well.
Beautiful. Well, thank you very much for being on the program today, Banjo.
Real pleasure, James. Thanks so much for having me. It's been great.
This program is hosted by James Henderson, with technical production by Jake Olver. Voiceovers were by Angus Brennan and Shim Phelan. Thanks to our distribution team, led by Stephanie Holland, and a special thanks to you for tuning in every week. This program was produced by H Media. We'll see you soon.